All right, folks. Next Civil War lecture. We discussed the pros and cons of putting a war effort together if you were the Lincoln or Davis administration. The next issue is going to be opening campaigns. I'm going to try to keep this fairly simple because, as I said, I've not had the time to redo these slides, so there's the information on here which I wouldn't not necessarily going to go on about. At the same time, I do want to give you a sense of what is actually happening. Let's take a look at the general map. So we talked a little bit last time about Confederate challenges in terms of both creating a nation state, and also putting a war effort on at the same time. Let's talk about strategy or grand strategy. If you're Davis, one of the questions you have is, what do you defend and what do you give up? Well, the short answer, as they kind of decided on, was that you can't afford to give up anything. If you tell any of the states that at great risk to themselves seceded from the United States, that they are expendable, that's not going to send shivers of confidence or surge of confidence through your citizenry, particularly those states on the borders. So the Confederate government basically comes up with it's the cordon strategy. You put a big line across the entirety of the Confederacy and you try to defend it all. That has been heavily criticized by a lot of people, historians over the years, that this is not a good strategy. This is not clear thinking. I tend to be a bit more understanding of this, in that the claims made along those lines are claims that reflect a very narrow view of what you have to do. Strategy is not made in a vacuum. It is not something which you make independent of politics, and the view that says, well, they should have come up with something else. They should have just defended key points and abandoned various areas to the Union armies. That's a viewpoint which kind of views war as a video game, in video game mode, in which you can do that without significant risks, instead of that this is part of war. The idea that politics is an extraneous consideration to war, there was a line of thinking along those lines. There was a line of thinking like that in the 1800s. Most professional military guys, though, particularly in the U.S., understood that there's an intimate connection between civilian politics and military strategy. So realistically, that's not going to happen. There are key areas you do need to defend. A couple of those areas, let's make this a bit bigger, a couple of those areas are going to be Western Tennessee. You have to defend Nashville. You need to defend Western Tennessee, including Island Number 10, New Madrid, Memphis. And of course, Tennessee is one of the backbone states in terms of contributing troops to the Confederate military. The other state you have to defend is Virginia. Virginia, is long and the most populous, the richest, the most prestigious of all the American states. It's now joined your new nation. It's a latecomer. You want to keep Virginia happy. So they put the capital in Richmond. That means that's a sign that they value, the Confederacy as a whole values Virginia's position. It also means you're going to have to defend it. So you have to hold in Virginia and you have to hold in Tennessee. You hold those two states, and everything west of the Mississippi, that's a whole other kettle of fish. We tend not to talk about the Trans-Mississippi Theater that much, and you can kind of see why. It's not that what happens out there is not unimportant, but in terms of what's going to win the war, what transpires in Tennessee and what transpires in Virginia is very important. The other thing, of course, is the Union blockade, which is only going to get more severe over time. So, the two main armies of the Confederacy are the Army of Tennessee and the Army, eventually what will be called the Army of Northern Virginia. There's only one good military commander in the Confederacy, ultimately, and that is Robert E. Lee. There's a tendency these days to sort of run Lee down because, sort of as compensation, to compensate for the fact that, particularly under Lost Cause mythology, he was praised to the skies as the greatest. He was greatest general since Napoleon. For so long that there's often a widespread feeling that we need to compensate for this. He really wasn't that good. He made an awful lot of mistakes. He insisted on attacking and running. He ran up his own casualty count. In fact, there was a very famous book, which I don't remember where that is. It's somewhere over on my shelf. I think it's Attack and Die. It's a very statistical study of Lee's casualty count versus, say, Grant's. And Lee actually does not come off looking very good in that. And so sort of military history community split on Lee's abilities. I tend to think he was good. I think he was very good as a commander. He made mistakes, as everyone did, because especially when he went on the offensive, because, well, that's very difficult. When the Army of Northern Virginia goes on the offensive, they often don't look much better than the Union Army. Lee is able to put maneuvers together that a lot of other generals in either side cannot. He knows the officer corps of both sides better than most of them. Almost every major battle in the Civil War is commanded by someone who was a West Point graduate. Lee knew most of them. A big number of them had been cadets while he was superintendent at West Point, so he basically had their equivalent of their psych evals. He knew how they thought. He knew their qualities, their weaknesses. He knew how to get in the mind, inside the head of his opponents. Did he make mistakes? Absolutely. He was by no means any kind of a paragon of military ability without equal, but he was very, very, very good. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, perhaps fortunately for the United States, for U.S. history, there was only one of him. You did have Stonewall Jackson, and of course Jackson is killed. Longstreet is nearly killed. One of the things that happens to Lee is he runs out of good commanders. The corps commanders he has who last mostly through the war are increasingly ineffective as time goes on. And the ones who are very good tend to be killed. Stewart's killed, Jackson's killed, Longstreet's nearly killed. And then Lee and Longstreet, sometimes they'd be that on-again, off-again relationship. By the end of the war, the Confederacy is running out of generals to promote, essentially. And, of course, big army commands depend a lot on whether Jefferson Davis likes you or not. Lee and Davis had a very good relationship. Davis was his own sort of military secretary. He was kind of a micromanager. Lee knew how to talk to him, how to suggest things to him. But if you got on Davis's bad side, forget it. And once on his bad side, you never recovered from that. So Joe Johnston, who commanded the army before Lee, he keeps retreating. Even though he's getting orders from Richmond, don't retreat, and eventually he's wounded, and Lee stops that and counterattacks. Turned out it's tremendously wasteful of men and equipment and munitions, but it does get inside McClellan's head. It kind of ends what was a very innovative Union plan to outflank Confederate armies and take Richmond by an amphibious operation. bypass that go down the Chesapeake. They don't ever try that again. Even in '64, Lincoln will not let Grant put his army on boats and sail down the Chesapeake. He has to march overland. Johnston is eventually he's put out west and doesn't get along with his other fellow commander, Pemberton. They lose the Vicksburg campaign to Grant. Johnson's in disgrace, but eventually he's brought back again. He's brought back again when Bragg is removed from command of Army of the Tennessee, because Bragg can't command the Army of Tennessee. He has his subordinate generals or officers challenging him to duels. He once asks everyone, look, no hard feelings, but if you'd rather not have me as your commander, who would rather not have me as your commander, put your hand up. And then he tells his aide, take all their names, all the people who raised their hands. It's ridiculous kind of stuff. Bragg is now Jefferson Davis' military advisor. Johnston's back in, and of course he retreats slowly. Again, this is the kind of interpersonal stuff that the Confederacy has to deal with. The Union problem is somewhat different, and I want to zoom out here. The Union problem is a matter of coordinating naval resources, Army resources, but also getting units combat experience and getting the right generals in the right places. Some of the most effective commanders for the Union don't start out in senior positions. They kind of have to work their way up and survive. This would include Ulysses S. Grant, who's working, in a store in Illinois. When the war starts, he gets a regiment. Before you know it, he's commanding, he's moving up the chain. He's commanding an army. He captures a couple Confederate armies at Forts Henry and Donaldson, which are right about here. But the overall Union commander is not super impressed with him. They're moving into northern Mississippi, and then the Battle of Shiloh happens, which is a bloodbath. Grant got a little careless. He did not have his troops dig in, even though that was kind of standard procedure. Some historians have said that, that's because he'd been out of the Army for a while. He was not up to date on doctrine, on current doctrine, which, Crimean War, official observations, McClellan's report, things like that. If he'd been in the military, he would have known this is what we do and this is why. He learns eventually, and he manages to win Shiloh on the second day. But this is kind of typical of the problems you have with the Union generals at the start of the war. McClellan, of course, is the main commander of what's called the Army of the Potomac. This is also a good rule of thumb. Confederate armies are named after places. Union armies are named after rivers. So the Army of the Potomac is the main army facing off against Lee. McClellan is beloved by the Union troops. He trains them very well. He looks after them. He's not going to commit them to fight unless he's pretty sure he can do something with them. The problem from McClellan, of course, is that he doesn't actually want to engage. He has a very high opinion of himself. Some of his letters to his wife are just, you can't help but laugh at the way he phrases this sometimes. I could probably become emperor if I wanted to. I would never do that because I love this country. I love it, but I could do it if I wanted to. And you have to think to yourself, wow. He frustrates Lincoln a lot. And there's a culture. We talk about cultures of command, institutional cultures. The Army of the Potomac has a very cautious culture. The people, it's the most political army because it's the one closest to the capital. So the people who are appointed to high command in that, they usually come with a lot of baggage. If they don't come with a lot of baggage, they don't come with a lot of experience, and that's effectively the same thing, because then they have to, without the benefit of experience, deal with politicians, including Lincoln, and also deal with their corps commanders who may or may not be scheming to remove them so they can take over. This is why the sort of the appointment of George Meade at very short notice in the early summer of '63 is such a, it's an interesting study in command. Hooker's relieved. This is Meade will now be the fourth commander the Army of the Potomac has had. All the other corps commanders know him, and in fact, the interesting thing about Gettysburg is that it's one of those times where the commander, no one really has a beef necessarily with Meade. I mean, he has a very bad temper. But no, there's not really anyone there who is saying, no, I really should be me, and I'm going to scheme to undermine. The major general commanding. They're all major generals. There's no lieutenant general rank until early '64. They're all major generals, so who's in command depends on the date they were promoted. That's why when you read letters from all these Union generals, it's always signed Major General, commanding. Meade has a rambunctious bunch under him. Some of them are brilliant. That's like Reynolds, 1st Corps. Some of them are adequate, like Sedgwick of the 6th Corps. Some are political appointees whom you really would not want to have in your army, but you're stuck with them, and they have, I guess, a modicum of military ability. That would be Dan Sickles of 3rd Corps, who was a corrupt New York politician. He murdered his wife's lover in broad daylight before the war, and then got off with the first successful use of the temporary insanity plea. And for all that, until he's, put out of commission at Gettysburg, he loses a leg at Gettysburg, Sickles is a relatively astute student of war. But there's always calculation. They're always going to be super cautious. They're not going to press their advantage. The Union armies in the West have a much different mentality, very different mentality to that. It's something that's going to irk Grant when he comes to the East. He's dealing with generals who are used to being political. And then you have generals like Ambrose Burnside, who commands the Army of the Potomac and then kind of has 9th Corps, which is kind of his independent command after he's relieved. Burnside was not the world's worst commander, despite what you hear about Fredericksburg. We don't have time to talk about it here. But Fredericksburg was not a bad plan, and things went wrong in ways that a lot of it you just could not predict. People like Burnside, they're kind of steady, but you're dealing with a political backdrop, which you just really kills the offensive spirit of the army, to use a kind of tired, jaded phrase. They're not going to really recover that until '65, when Grant basically empowers people, particularly Sheridan, who is his own. Sheridan is Grant's man. They come from the West, hard charging and so on. If you think any commander is not pushing and taking the initiative, you can relieve them on the spot. That includes corps commanders. Now, in fairness to the Union generals of the Army of the Potomac, what they would like to say is, well, that's nice that you have all this success in the West. You're not facing Robert E. Lee. You also have a lot of room to maneuver. The rivers in the West often they run in all different directions. A lot of them are north-south. The rivers in Virginia run east-west. They're just large enough to not be able to cross easily. You have a very narrow coastal plain. Surprise is not an option here. Lee's going to know you're coming from one direction or the other. And he's very good. So that's nice, but you haven't faced Lee. And when Grant comes east to take command of the military, of all U.S. forces in '64, Army of the Potomac, they'd already seen a Western general come east. That's Pope. This is 1862. This is the Second Bull Run campaign, where there's a sort of a rival Union army created called the Army of Virginia. And, Lee deals with that in very short order. McClellan doesn't help. He doesn't try to cooperate. And, Lincoln's pretty fed up with this. But they've seen Western generals come east. They don't do particularly well when they're against Lee. So, we have the cordon defense issue. We have issues with personalities and commanders. We have the different sort of issues affecting choice of commanders and how they interact with their political leadership. And then it comes to the actual campaigns themselves. The interesting thing is that by the end of 1862, as we go into January 1st, let's say January 2nd, 1863, the Confederacy has they're still intact. They're still almost completely intact, but they have more or less shot their bolt in terms of having quasi-coordinated armies advancing on multiple fronts. In the autumn of 62, Lee's invasion of Maryland is turned back at Sharpsburg or Antietam. It's a tactical victory for the Confederates, but Lee is forced to withdraw, and that's a strategic victory for the Union. In the far south, New Orleans falls to U.S. forces, so the largest export port in the Confederacy is gone. So you can forget about those massive exports of cotton to help keep the Southern economy afloat. Attempted invasions of Kentucky have been turned back, and then the final piece to this puzzle is what happens in Murfreesboro. If you ever get a chance and you're driving along, Route 70, US 75, I-75, you stop there. That's really worth seeing. It's spread out a fair bit, but it's the visitor center's worth seeing. The different points on the battlefield. It's kind of spread out, but it's well worth visiting. Murfreesboro is also called Stones River. It's a 2-day engagement, December 31st, January 1st, 62-63. It's the highest. It's not the bloodiest battle of the war, but it is the highest percentage of casualties for the armies. About 40% of the forces engaged in total are casualties. At the end of this, Bragg has to withdraw. Rosecrans, who's commanding the Army of the Cumberland, I think it was the Army of the Cumberland at that time, holds the field. And Lincoln was waiting to hear what happens at this battle before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. He was pretty sure he was going to do it after Lee withdraws from Maryland. Wanted just to make sure that this was going to be a victory or something they could call a victory before he issues it. That's as we go into 63. So I'm not going to go into all the details here of this. I think this is Antietam. Was this? Yeah, the specifics of Antietam and the Dunkard Church. And I'm not going to go into that right now. What's more important to remember is the bigger strategic picture. As you head into 63, there seems to be no apparent change in anything. Union blockade is still there. A big blow has been dealt to the southern economy and southern Confederate finances. Confederate armies have gone on the offensive in different fronts, and they've all been turned back, sometimes very often very bloodily, and not making the Union forces look too good, but they have. And so as we head into the Gettysburg campaign, or what's going to be Gettysburg, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Confederacy is very, very, very much intact.